Welcome to tonight's Aspire session with Professor Omid Safi. This series aims to explore topics relating to faith and the world in our current times, that we find ourselves in, and to provide avenues for thoughtful reflection and inspiration. My name is Haleema Welji. In anthropology, which is my discipline, we often start with a land acknowledgement, which is a way of recognizing the history, our country's history, and the exploitation of indigenous peoples. So I'm speaking to you from the ancestral land of the Kumeyaay people. All right, so in light of the recent killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, as well as numerous other countless other Black individuals, there's no one better that I can think of to talk to than Dr. Omid Safi for his spiritual perspectives on Islam, love, social justice, and for thinking about how do we turn that thinking into action and action in the name of justice. In terms for tonight, just a little bit of housekeeping. You will only be able to see Dr. Safi and me for this session. At any time during the presentation, you can send questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Safi has recorded his lecture in advance to prevent any sort of technological glitches that may happen. So in a few minutes, you will begin to see a recorded presentation, and then he and I will be back for a live question and answer. Dr. Omid Safi is a professor of Asian and Middle Eastern studies, as well as Islamic studies at Duke University. He specializes in the study of Islamic mysticism and contemporary Islam and Sufism. He has written and edited many books, including Progressive Muslims on Justice, Gender, and Pluralism, The Cambridge Companion to American Islam, Politics of Knowledge in Pre-Modern Islam, and Memories of Muhammad. His most recent book is Radical Love, Teachings from the Islamic Mystical Traditions. He regularly writes and thinks about issues of social justice, Islam and its relation to civil rights, and questions of race and immigration in America. While and faculty at Duke and the University of North Carolina have perhaps the easiest access to Professor Safi, he has made his teachings more publicly available through his online courses on spirituality, through Illuminated courses, and inshallah will once again be able to continue Illuminated tours, guided spiritual journeys to Turkey and Morocco. So thank you, Dr. Safi, for joining us tonight. I will over to you to say a few words and to start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Welji. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Ya Ali Madad. It is such a pleasure to be with you all, friends, and to be yet again the guest of the Smiley community, a community that over the years I've had the extraordinary pleasure and delight of accompanying. I need not pause to remind all of us that we are living in the midst of a period of almost unprecedented upheaval. And we are being asked as citizens of the communities that we call home, as well as Muslims, to bring the wholeness of our being and be participants in restoring a sense of justice and well-being, dignity, and honor for the places that we call home. At a time where you see environmental crises, certainly the pandemic that is wreaking havoc all over the world, the racial tensions that are so evident, these are not new wounds, but it is, they're becoming so apparent to us. It might seem a little strange to start the conversation by talking about love. And I'm going to ask for your indulgence because we are going to come back around to the conversations that are on everybody's mind. And the main point of what I'm going to be asking us to consider is the following notion. We as Muslims are heirs, the inheritors of one of the extraordinary wisdom traditions to humanity. When we speak about love in this tradition, and this is the subject of our discussion tonight, we are not talking about emotional, sentimental fluff. In the Muslim tradition, love is nothing short of the very being of Allah that is unleashed upon the cosmos. It is love that brings us here, it is love that sustains us here, and it will be love that will deliver us home. Now, one of the distinguishing features of the understandings of love and spirituality in Islam is that this love is a movement. And when it moves from the individual out into the society, recognize it as justice. That's all we mean by justice. It is not simply a matter of distributing economic resources and assets in an equitable fashion, though of course it has to involve that. What we mean by justice is all of us can imagine somebody who is dear and precious to us. We know how we would want them to live, the dignity that we would want to have guaranteed for them. And justice means that we recognize the same love and concern for our neighbors and strangers. And particularly at a time where old racial wounds, old class wounds are so apparent to so many, where it seems like it is an age from a more far right side, an age of bombast, an age of anger, an age of vitriol. It's also a reminder for us that the same love, when it moves inward, we recognize it as tenderness. So that's the setup for our conversation for this evening. We're talking about love not as sentimentality, but as that divine force which propels us into the public as human beings that stand up for righteousness, stand up for dignity, starting with those who find themselves weak and vulnerable. And at the same time, when that same love moves inward, we remain tender human beings. That in our struggle to achieve justice out in the world, we don't want to lose the tenderness of our own hearts. So with your permission, I'll go ahead and start the pre-recorded talk that I have for you. And we're going to start with love, and then we're going to circle back around and come to justice. And meanwhile, I'll be looking over your questions that are coming in, and we'll have a nice discussion afterwards, inshallah. Bismillah. I invite you to join us on our other programs as well. You can always find our information online at Illuminated Courses. We offer courses on the Quran and Islamic spirituality. Thank you for being with us on this session. Hello, I'd like to welcome you back to our presentation on the path of radical love. This path has been one of the most important and dynamic paths within the world of Islamic spirituality. Many of the greatest of Muslim mystics, poets, lovers, and dreamers, such as Rumi and Hafiz and others, have come out of this particular path. And perhaps we should begin the way that they would begin. They would begin not with a systematic presentation, but by telling you a story. And so the story that I'd like to tell you in its written form is over 800 years old. And in its oral tradition, it's perhaps over 1,000 years old. The story is of an African, a North African, Egyptian Sufi saint named Zulnoon al-Misri, Zulnoon al-Misri in the Eastern languages. And it is recorded in the lives of illuminated beings, the lives of saints, that the Persian poet Fariduddin Attar recorded. And in this account, Zulnoon, this Egyptian saint, has a visionary experience, a dream of the day of resurrection. In this dream, he dreams that all the human beings who have ever been are gathered together and summoned in the presence of Allah. He says that all the people who have ever been, all the ones who are, and all the ones who shall forever be are brought together. They hear the voice of God coming to them a number of times, and each time God offers them a gift, an offering, and these are free offerings. There doesn't seem to be any conditions attached to them. So the first time that they hear the voice of God, God says to them, "Who amongst you would like to have all the worldly delights and pleasures, the sum totals of all the earthly delights that I have ever created?" So people look around and they're like, wow, the sum total of all the worldly pleasures, that sounds really lovely. So they kind of look around and they ask themselves, what's the catch? The catch is there is no catch. The catch is there's no catch. Okay, so 90% of them put up their hands and they wait there hesitatingly to see what gives, and they hear the voice of God. It is granted unto you. The total of all the earthly delights and pleasures is yours. So they're quite ecstatic and happy, and they leave. They hear the voice of God a second time. Who amongst you would like to be spared all pain, all suffering? Who would like to be spared hellfire, pain, disease, death? Wow. So the ones who are left look around and they go, to avoid pain and suffering. That sounds really good, right? To be spared hellfire and any pain in existence eternally. Wow. So of the ones who are left, about 90% of those put up their hand and they wait. It is granted unto you. So they do the happy dance and they leave. There's a smaller crowd left. They hear the voice of God a third time. Who amongst you would like to be granted admission to my loftiest paradise? A garden so bathed in light that no eye has ever seen it and no words have ever described it. Wow, a garden so bathed in light, a paradise so lofty that no eyes have ever seen, no words have ever described. So of this smaller crowd who are left, they look around and about 90% of those put up their hand and they wait. The voice of God comes to them yet again. It is granted unto you. And they leave. And Zulnoon says that after the ones who had chosen earthly delights, who had chosen to be spared pain and suffering, and who had chosen God's loftiest paradise, had all chosen their gifts, there was but a small trickle of us left. And he says, this time around, we heard the voice of God come to us like a thunder. I gave you every earthly delight, you chose it not. I offered you redemption from hellfire, pain and suffering, you chose it not. I even offered you the chance to be admitted to my most luminous garden. You chose it not. What have you come here for? And Zulnoon says that the few of us who were left put down our heads in humility and we said, you yourself know what is in our heart. We did not come for earthly pleasure. We did not come to be spared hellfire. We didn't even come for the garden. We came for you. And Zulnoon says that there was a long pause, and then they heard the voice of God come to them one last time, this time quite gently, in which God said to them, in that case, then I am yours. I am yours. This story, this powerful story, in its written form over 800 years old, in its oral tradition about 1,000 years old, has been always a reminder that within the wider world of Islam, within the wider world of Islamic spirituality, which we might call the Sufi tradition, there have always been those who've been in it for the sake of God, even above and beyond any spiritual experience, any earthly delight, and even beyond salvation. These are the ones who love, as someone has said, the gardener more than the garden. They are the ones who are only after God's own heart, and God is after them. This is the path that the mystics of this tradition refer to as the path of radical love. Radical love. And it's probably a good idea to take a couple of minutes to talk about these words, radical and love. Well, love, of course, is one of the ultimate expressions of intimacy and closeness. You know the one that you love, and you love the one that you know. The mystics of this tradition always go on to tell you that in this tradition, love, what we're translating as ishq, radical love, is not simply a human emotion. Love is not a feeling. Love is not something that comes and goes. You don't say that I love you today and I may stop loving you tomorrow. I love chocolate and I love God. Although on second thought, you might love chocolate in something approaching the divine. No, love for these mystics is not a mere passing human emotion. Love, radical love for them, is nothing short of the very unleashing of God onto this realm. Love is not even a divine quality among other qualities. Love is the very essence of God. It is the overflowing of God as love that brings the world into creation, that sustains the world here. And if we as human beings can just get over our own selves and merge into this cosmic current of love, then we can return back to our divine source. So in some ways, the goal of this particular path is to transcend the confines of selfish and egoistical existence and harmonize one's being, one's life, with this divine outpouring, overflowing of love. So I think that's part of the reason why love is something sacred and not simply sentimental. It's not just emotional. As I sometimes have said before, love is not an emoji. You don't text love to somebody. You become love. You embody love. You walk the path of love. You become this love. And then there's also that word radical. Radical. Radical, a word that, particularly when it comes to Muslims, many people are hesitant to use these days for all the understandable reasons, that to be called a radical and an extremist carries with it certain political consequences. But there's a couple of further elements worthy of thought there. One, if part of the notion of being a radical is to go out to the extremes, to live life to the utmost, well, yes, that is, in fact, something that we're always called to do. You find, in fact, that many spiritual teachers and mystics of different traditions talk about this notion. Even if you take a look at Dr. King's commentary on love, he at one point says, we're called to be extremists in the cause of love and justice. Was Jesus not an extremist in the cause of love? And these mystics of the Islamic tradition have the exact same awareness, have the exact same recognition. Part of what they do, in a way that is very consistent with all the rest of the worldview and the ethics of the Islamic tradition, is they're always interested in this movement between the inner and the outer. This is what we might call toggling back and forth between the manifest and the unmanifest worlds. So one of the great teachings of this tradition, which is also found in other traditions, is that when this love comes into public, we call it justice. We recognize it as justice. All that we mean by justice is simply that you know in your own heart how much you love your babies. You know what you would want for your babies. You would want to have food in their bellies, a roof over their head, dignity in their bones. What we mean by justice is simply the awareness and the recognition that other people love their babies just as much as you love yours. So if you wouldn't want your babies to go hungry at night, don't you dare be silent when somebody else's baby is going hungry. And if you wouldn't want to see your babies homeless or under occupation or under sanctions or the victim of racism or police brutality, the rocks are going to cry out if you're silent when other people's babies are in that situation. So here again, you see how a movement of love is leading you outward to taking a stance for justice out of a sense of love and ultimate concern for the well-being of people, particularly those who at the moment might find themselves vulnerable. But in the same way that this tradition flows from the inward to the outward, it also toggles back, not just to the public arena, but also to the private arena. So the same teachers tell us, when the same love that shows up outwardly as justice moves inward, we call it tenderness. Tenderness. So the same person who, out of the desire for radical love, will be a fierce warrior for justice out in the public square, is the same person who is tender in their dealing with their fellow human beings privately. The very same word that I've translated as radical love, ishq, the word radical is also important for us to ponder upon. Radical today has a connotation of being an extremist. At times even might have the connotation of being violent. But that's not what the origin of the word radical was. The word radical originally meant to go back to the origin, to go back to the root of something. And in fact, when you study the words of the Muslim mystics of the path of radical love, they are constantly calling us to return to the root of our being, to go back to the heart of the heart, to the essence of the essence. Rumi, for example, uses the beautiful metaphor of a tree. Every tree has to be rooted and grounded in something, and he begs you, he pleads with you, find out what it is that is rooting you. When the storms of life come, are you grounded? Are you rooted in something? Right? A tree might be very tall and majestic, but if it's not rooted, the first good stiff wind is going to knock it over. And he also is reminding you that the roots of a tree are how it derives its nutrients, its sustenance. And if you're not rooted, then the tree is going to wither. It's going to become a brittle tree. And they're using the same metaphor to talk about the religious life. You might see people who are doing everything that they're supposed to, believing everything that they're supposed to, but that their religiosity is a kind of dry religiosity. There's nothing moist and tender and loving and kind and gentle about them. And so they're telling you, don't be that. Don't be a dry religious tree, because a dry tree will give you no fruit. Be moist, be supple, be soft. There's great strength in softness, in gentleness. The strongest of people are sometimes the most gentle. So let's take a look at the ways that this understanding of the path of radical love, this way of existing for the sake of God, leads these mystics to experience God and the prophet and religion and society and community in a more gentle way. So I've written a book called Radical Love, which is an anthology of the sayings of the Muslim mystics of this path. And I'm going to walk us through some of these different teachings. We're going to start with the way that they lead us to think about God as the God of love. That what we know as love is ultimately the outpouring of God, and that the ways in which love is the ultimate divine essence. So we know, for example, that within the context of the Quran, there are 114 chapters. And of those 114 chapters, 113 of them begin with the phrase, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the eternally merciful, the ever merciful, the ever compassionate. 113 out of the 114 chapters of the Quran. And the only one that doesn't have it has another mention in the chapter to make up for it. So think about this. If we're told that God has 100 names in the Quran, and of all of those 100 names, it's the same two, Rahman and Rahim. Rahman and Rahim, the merciful and the compassionate and the loving, that are repeated over and over and over again. Right? If you had to introduce yourself, and of all the roles, all the qualities that you had to tell people about, I'm a teacher, I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm a father. And you come back to the same two ways. Well, at some point, and if you do that 113 times over and over again, people might start to get the idea that these two qualities are quite important to how you see yourself. Some of the great Muslim mystics, Ibn Arabi, for example, the great Andalusian Muslim, paraphrases a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, in which he says that these words, Rahman and Rahim, two Arabic names of God, which we usually translate simply as the compassionate, the merciful, the lovingly merciful, infinitely merciful, eternally compassionate. And merciful and compassionate are great. They're wonderful qualities. Ibn Arabi goes to the root of those words, as the Prophet Muhammad had done. And he says, Rahman and Rahim in Arabic come from the root word Rahim, which means the womb. The womb. And he says, Ka'anna, it is as if the entire cosmos, all the infinite universes, are as if contained inside the womb of God. So, in a tradition which deliberately avoids using the language of God the Father and God the Mother, right? So, unlike the Christian and the Jewish tradition, where we have so many prayers about, "O Heavenly Father," right? The Islamic tradition does not use fatherly and motherly language to talk about God, but there's this very strong maternal and feminine imagery that the Prophet is using and Ibn Arabi is picking up on. It is as if the entire cosmos is contained within the divine womb, Rahim, and this is why God is Rahman and Rahim, compassionate, lovingly merciful. It is as if God is pregnant with you, and creation is God giving birth to you. So in that saying of the Prophet, you are contained within the divine. So many of us, spiritually and religiously, might make the mistake of thinking, where is God? How can I find God? Where do I have to go to find God? What journey do I have to set out to find God? And these mystics are telling you, you are already contained inside the divine. You would have no existence were it not for God. The great mystic Rumi tells you, you are the fish in the ocean. And you keep swimming around going, where's the ocean? Where's the ocean? Why can't I see the ocean? You have no word for the ocean because you're already in the ocean. If somehow you could be lifted out of the ocean, then you would be like, let me back in, let me back in. And in fact, we see that many Muslim mystics love to tell these stories about the ways in which they experience this quality of closeness to God. So we're going to take a look for 1 second at the teachings of one of the most important Muslim mystics, the great Sufi Rabia. Rabia is quite possibly the most important female Muslim mystic. She is the embodiment of God's love. And there are a number of very powerful stories that we get from Rabia, and I'd like to share 2 of them with you here. So here's one. This one is called A Door Never Closed. A man not knowing said to God. The way that the story is sometimes imagined is that Rabia is walking past a temple, a church, a mosque. She lived in what is today Iraq, and Iraq at that time was a religiously mixed place. And there's a preacher perhaps sitting on the pulpit and repeating the anecdote, the story that so many of us have heard. Um, Knock and it shall be opened unto you. Ask and it shall be given to you. And so she hears this preacher repeating this statement. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. So she just stops and she pokes her head into the mosque or the church and she says, "What did you say?" And this preacher sitting on the pulpit is quite annoyed that this woman has interrupted his majestic speech. So in a rather gruff voice, he said, as a way of reprimanding her, "I said, knock, and it shall be opened unto you." Rabia says, "You fool, the door has never been closed." The door has never been closed. So there's this emphasis within the Sufi tradition that the path to God is one that is perpetually open, never closed. And this notion of the wide open God, the ever immersive experience of being with God, is one of the characteristics of this particular path. In the image that you see here with you, you see the way that Rabia is oftentimes represented. She is walking with a lit torch in one hand and a vase or a bucket of water in the other hand, right? So this is the juxtaposition of opposites. And this is in fact one of the things that the saintly beings are described as. They're the ones who reconcile in themselves that which we oftentimes treat separately. And people say, "Rabia, that's a really strange thing to do, to have fire and water, both of them together. What you doing?" And her response is this particular prayer. "O Lord, my loving Lord, if I worship you for fear of hell, burn me in that hell. If I worship you hoping for paradise, make it forbidden for me. But if I worship you only for your own sake, do not withhold from me your everlasting beauty. اگر از برای تو را می پرستم، جمال باقی از من دریغ مدار." If I worship you only for your own sake, do not withhold from me your everlasting beauty. This teaching of the path of love as one in which the door to God is always open, has never been closed, is also talked about in one of the verses of the Quran, "Wallahu muhitun min wara'ihim." God encompasses you from the behind. Okay? So for prayer, we line up in a certain direction towards Mecca. We identify that direction and we call it the Qibla. And in life, when we pray, we might look up. I have a very fond memory of my beautiful daughter, Layla. She was probably 3 or 4 years old, and I would put her to bed at nights and say a little prayer with her. And I remember that I was tucking her in bed, and I said to her, "My love, I hope that God watches over you and keeps you safe at night." And she, 3, 4-year-old child, took my finger and brought it back to my heart and said, Baba, God is not up there, God is in here. Right? A child, you shall hear truth from out of the mouth of babes. A child knew that God is not simply out there, but also within, also behind you. Right? You are the fish in the ocean. Rumi takes that same notion and changes it, alters it in a really beautiful and powerful way. He says, my friend, you have been knocking at God's door your whole life. You knock and you knock and you knock, wondering when it's going to be open. Friend, you are knocking from the inside. You are already inside the divine presence. And you keep wondering why the door is not opening. So this notion that the whole point of the path of love is a shifting of one's perspective, of a recognition that here and now you are already with the divine. That's one of the characteristics of these Sufis. They are not waiting for the hereafter to be with God. They want to see the face of God right here and right now. It's one of the reasons why these mystics are sometimes called Ibnul Waqt, Bintul Waqt, a child of the moment, a child of the eternal now. Right? We're all going to see the face of God in the day of resurrection, but they want to see the presence of God here and now. That emphasis on the eternal now, that entire infinity which is present inside this very breath, is of course one of the commonalities that we see in so many religious traditions. And it's one of the reasons why the mystics remind us that to live in the present moment, not as a kind of license for carpe diem, not as a license for hedonism and go out there and do whatever it is that you would want, but rather to be mindful of the breath. So many of us simply view the breath as this mechanical way whereby we take in oxygen and we release the wasted breath. Different Sufis have different meditation techniques. Some of them simply begin by telling you to take your hand and put it on your chest, to feel the beating of your heart, to experience the breath entering your chest and then releasing it, perhaps even to repeat that sensation a few times. You start to become mindful of the beating of your heart. Perhaps you can start to feel the beating of your heart not only within your chest, but echoing throughout your body. And typically, when you start paying attention to your breath, you become mindful of how for so long we've been taking very shallow breaths. So many of us, as part of the busyness of our existence, have gotten accustomed to taking short, shallow breaths that just seem to go down to here and then come back out. Take a deep breath and you allow it to relax your shoulders and to relax your chest and to take the breath deep inside and fill, and even maybe go into your belly and fill all of that. You notice that your heart rate slows down, your breathing rate slows down. There's a more serene experience. You could allow your awareness to return to that state as often as you need it to. That sense of ease and serenity is one of the ways that the mystics of this path describe their existence in this world. It is not that life is easy. No, there is genuine pain and suffering in this world. But you're always mindful of the fact that the one who sends the pain also sends the remedy. As the Quran mentions, "Inna ma'al usri yusra," alongside suffering and difficulty, there's also provided ease. It is not simply that the ease comes after the difficulty. No, the ease is already inside, provided alongside it. And this also extends to the way that the mystics of this path come to relate to their experience of God. So, for example, in much of the Abrahamic traditions, we have words like God as the Lord, God as the King. And it's true, there is a hierarchical element. There is a, if you would, a vertical element. That if God were simply just down here as one of us, well, that would take away something of the majesty of the divine. And the mystics of the path of radical love do not eradicate the notion of God as the Almighty, as the glorious, as the majestic, but they add to it an element of intimacy, of love, of tenderness, of closeness. So some of them say things like, this is Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani, "When I'm in public, I call you Lord. When I'm in private, I call you my beloved." In public, I call you Lord. In private, I call you my beloved. Even that word Lord, which in English, of course, has a feudal context, it has a kingly context. In Arabic, Rabb is your cherishing Lord, your nurturing Lord. It's from the same root as the word Rebbe in Hebrew. A murabbi is a guide, almost a gardener who tends to the flowers in the field. You're not lording over them, you are nurturing them. You're helping them grow and achieve your full potential. What if we come to think of the divine as the one who is aiding us become everything that we are meant to be? And even there, in public, I call you Lord. In private, I call you my beloved. One of the mystics, Sahl Tustari, was asked, tell me about this whole path of love, if you had to sum it up. And his answer was, Ba Khuda rahat budan. It's to be at ease with God. To be at ease with God. We are told in the Chishti tradition that the very last words of the Prophet Muhammad were Ar-Rafiq al-A'la, the highest friend. The highest friend. Right? Upon ending his earthly embodiment, the very last words of the Prophet were that. Another one of the mystics, Shibli, says at one point, the mystics are like children in the lap of their mother, right? Imagine that feeling of safety, of comfort, of love, of being in your home base. That's what for them that return to the divine embrace is like. And that's one of the reasons why in the meditation practices that the mystics of this path do, which is oftentimes beginning with the declaration of faith, the La ilaha illallah, there is no God except for the one loving God, except for Allah. You begin with La ilaha, there is no God, small g, illallah, except for the one God. Before you can affirm God as the beloved, as the cherishing, nourishing, sustaining Lord, you have to do the La ilaha. You have to dismiss all of these tribal, violent, outdated, perhaps overly masculine understandings of God, in which God just looks like an angry old white man with a beard up in the sky. No, we have to sweep away. La ilaha. These are not God. Jesus has to kick the tables of the money changers, chase them out of God's temple. And before you can come back to illallah, except for the one God, you have to get rid of all these outmoded and outdated understandings. And then you come back to this model of a loving, nourishing, sustaining God. I think to end this session, we're going to end with two more little stories and anecdotes. One of them is a story from a wonderful semi-illiterate early Muslim mystics named Kharagoni. Kharagoni, Persian from what is today Iran, a shepherd humble man who just collected thorns out of the desert. That was his way of making a living. And he talked to God very freely. He talked to God like a friend. His radical love path was not some path of erudite university scholars. No, he was a shepherd who just talked to God like a friend. And God talked to him like a friend. They had a very affectionate, friendly, humorous relationship. So he oftentimes whispered his thoughts and prayers to God, and God talked back to his heart. And these are recorded. So he says that at one point he had a dream. People had dreams of God all the time. Nowadays, they would probably institutionalize you. Back then, if the message was about God, they might have called you a saint. Says that I heard the voice of God come to me and say, he had a son named Hassan. So Kharagoni was called Hassan's daddy, Hassan's baba. Bul Hassana, Hassan's daddy. Do you want me to go and tell people everything that I know to be wrong with you in your heart? Do you want me to go and tell them what a hypocrite you are? Do you want me to go and tell them how you say one thing and you do another? Do you want me to expose you in front of all the people? And if I do, they might stone you. Kharagoni doesn't miss a beat. He talks back to God, right? This is that friendly, loving aspect of the lives of some of these illuminated beings. And he says to God, my friend, my Lord, my beloved, do you want me to go and tell people about how much you love them? And if I do, and when I do, then not a single one of them is going to do their prayers or their fasting or any of these things that you keep asking them to do. because you love your creation so much more than a mother loves her newborn child. Kharagoni says there was a long pregnant pause, and then he heard the voice of God come to him and say, how about this? I say nothing, you say nothing. I say nothing, you say nothing. The story of Kharagoni is recorded here. His statue and paintings are recollected in this tradition, and his shrine is still a place that people can go and do pilgrimage. So I think we are going to stop that encounter here, and this is an ongoing tradition. I hope that we remember that the path of radical love, which they would see as going back to the life of the Prophet, being rooted in the Quran, and a flowing, living tradition that would encompass people like Ahmad Ghazali, Rumi, Kharagoni, Zulnun Misri, Rabia, Hafiz, and others, is one that continues down to our own day and age. So I thank you for this time. I wanted to thank you for having joined us on this program on radical love. If you enjoyed what you listened to, I invite you to come and be with us on our other courses and offerings. You can always find them online at Illuminated Courses. And we currently have a program, a whole course of lectures on the heart of Rumi's poetry, which you can also find at www.illuminatedcourses.com, as well as our new course on the Quran. So thank you again for having been with us. Great.
All right. Thank you so much for the presentation that you shared.
Sure.
I wanted to begin our questions with really thinking about taking what we have learned about justice as being love outward, and start with thinking a little bit more about how does that work in theory and what are some of the practice of that. So if we think about justices in our contemporary society, there's definitely a push for thinking about it within a peaceful frame. And as Muslims, we ground our Islam in the idea of peace. But if you think about all of the peaceful protests that have happened in past history, you know, it moves the needle very little. And it seems like what we see now is overflowing of that frustration. So how do we think about peace in Islam when social justice sometimes needs more of a push, more of a violence? What would you say, or how do you think about these concepts?
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful question. And obviously an incredibly timely one as well. You know, one of the things that I oftentimes try to suggest to friends is that it's very helpful for us to think about when we're discussing peace and that this desire that we have for peace, what are we really talking about? Dr. King, whom I tend to think of in many ways as a Christian Sufi, you know, he talked about how there is a negative peace and a positive peace. And he said what people usually say that they want peace, what they want is an absence of tension, right? They would want for people to stop protesting, demonstrating, to maybe stop sounding so angry. And he says, but we got to move through that negative piece and get to the positive piece, which is the presence of justice. So we got to get to the underlying cause. What is it that is leading to the dissatisfaction of people? Of course, we know that riots are the voice of the unheard. And this is one of those important points that we have to kind of think about. are we more concerned? Are we more unsettled and disturbed by the anger with which millions of people are telling us that they cannot breathe? Or are we equally and even more so concerned about the systems, the institutions, and the structures that are leading to their suffering? I think that's the point in which it's imperative upon us to be willing to go deeper, to be asking those structural questions that I think all too often we are hesitant to do.
Yeah, I like that, because really getting to the root of it is forcing us to really question and think about, how do we enact this justice? How do we enact this love? And that leads me to my second question. If we take the radical as a looking back and a turning back to the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad was a merchant in his time.
Yep.
And while he certainly didn't live in a capitalist system like we do now, how can we use the role model of the Prophet to help us think about this tension that we see, this reconciling between capitalism, Islam, and being an advocate for social justice? What would it look like to be a consumer or someone who lives in a capitalist economy acting out this justice and this love?
You know, I think that's a really wonderful question. And I know that this is a deeply relevant one for the Ismaili community, so many of whom have scattered all over the world through mercantile contexts. And it's a community that is known for its cosmopolitanism and philanthropy and so many other traits as well. So it is true that within the 1400-year tradition of Islam, there's always been a notion that one of the goals of religion is the protection of life, the protection of dignity, right? Honor, and then the protection of people's property. So even within notions of law, of Sharia, there's something called the Makasid of Sharia, the aims of Sharia, and the protection of life, dignity, and property is spelled out as the goals of Sharia. Fair enough. And if, in fact, if you travel throughout Muslim majority countries, you tend to find statements that people have. The one who earns a livelihood is beloved to God, right? Al-Qasib Habibullah. And that's also true. I think the question that we got to ask ourselves is, what was the kind of world in which the Prophet lived? Could he have ever imagined a world in which we've got, as I'm seeing, 505 people on this call right now? Could he have imagined a world in which 50 people, 50 single individuals own more property than 80% of humanity? Could he have imagined a world in which the top 1% of society in this country, the richest society in the history of humanity, owns 42% of the wealth? And this is where we got to start asking some of those questions, that the circulation, the distribution of wealth has to mean something more than an individual act of charity. What do we do with the fact that in the richest country on earth, 20% of children go to bed hungry at night? Right? This is not simply a political crisis. It's not simply an economical crisis, though it is that. It's a religious crisis. It's a crisis of the conscience. And so I think whenever I hear people discuss the notion of capitalism and the sacredness of private property in Islam only in an abstract and only through, well, you know, we have this statement in the sayings of the Prophet and this is what the Islamic legal tradition said, I don't think that it's actually in touch with the world in which we live, where the discrepancy between the super haves and the absolute have-nots has gotten to such an obscene level that at some point it calls for something much more fundamental in terms of the circulation of wealth.
Yeah, it reminds me of Nina Simone saying that the role of an artist to it's their duty to reflect on the times, and I think that's something that as scholars, but also as individuals in whatever field you're in, it is your duty as a Muslim to really think about what is the time I'm in and how do I think about transitioning between prophet and the current time.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's not enough just to know our ancient teachings. We have to know ourselves and we have to know the world in which we live.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were speaking, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the concept of beauty and how that might interact with love. How do you envision that fitting in within this context as well?
Oh, what a great question. What a great question. You know, one of my very favorite verses in the Quran is that verse that I know many of our friends on the call see it. And it's one that says, "Sanurihim ayatina fil afaq wa fi anfusihim." We're going to show you, we, God, are going to show you our signs, obviously in the Quran. I would also extend that to great poetry, great literature, the Ginan tradition, anything that is part of poetry, literature, music. Fil afaq, on the horizons, within the natural world, wafi anfusahum, and also inside your own souls. And it's when you bring these three realms together, when you look for beauty in nature, you look for beauty in human beings, and you look for a religion that is rooted in love, in mercy, in tenderness, and in beauty, and you bring it together, that's when God becomes haq. That's when God becomes real. So beauty, on one hand, you know, we are obsessed with beauty. There are standards of beauty that are imposed, particularly on women, entirely unattainable, entirely unrealistic. The very bodies of women become marketized, become commodified. They're told that they have to keep purchasing and consuming things in order to live up to this ideal. And we should always resist that. We should always push back against that. But that thirst for beauty is actually a much deeper inclination that we have. Because real beauty, not the commodified, marketized, sexualized one, but real beauty, that's the beauty that you feel when you have your feet in a brook. That's the beauty that you feel when you hear the wind rustling through the leaves. That's when you have a child giggling. That's when you see a bird take to flight, or you read a great poem, or you listen to great music. And I think that beauty brings you back to that notion, Inna Allaha Jamil wa yuhibbul Jamal. God is beautiful and God loves beauty. So that beauty becomes a magnetic pull that brings you back to the embrace of the divine, if we allow ourselves.
Thank you. For you, Rumi has been an avenue for developing your spiritual tradition and your spiritual practice. I'm wondering, for individuals that would like to develop more of a spiritual practice, perhaps, you know, they've done Rumi, but they're looking for something else. Do you have any advice for someone who wants to start developing that tradition? And also, you know, what is that advice? But then, why is that important? Why is it? What might it bring to them to develop further that spiritual tradition and practice?
Well, you know, the mischievous answer is very easy. What do you do after Rumi? More Rumi. Rumi is an ocean that is never ending. So you just want to go deeper and deeper and deeper into it. But, you know, look, this has to be something that speaks to people's soul. And one of the things that we're all realizing nowadays. And I realize it as a parent, as a teacher, as somebody who loves and cares for my community, as I love and care for humanity, is the things that feed my soul may or may not be the things that feed somebody else's soul. So anybody who is looking to grow deeper, grow spiritually, one of the things that I always suggest for them to do is to do muraqabah and muhasabah, to examine their own heart and to observe their heart, to see what is nurturing their soul, what is feeding their soul. For some people, it might be prayer, it might be going to Jamaat Khana, it might be reading the Quran, reading Rumi, reading some great religious poetry. For somebody else, it might be deep, spiritual, intimate, tender conversation. For somebody else, it might be the touch of your mother. For somebody else, it might be going for a walk in the woods. For somebody else, it might be solitude. Find that thing that feeds your heart and do it and do it and do it again until it becomes a habit. And then as you move down life's journey, keep examining, is the thing that fed my soul when I was in my 20s still the thing that feeds my soul now? Because you might find that there are things that fed your ancestor's soul that need some tweaking for you. And there might be some things that fed your soul when you were 30 that a couple of decades later might need just a little bit of fine tuning. So I think that sense of examining your heart and knowing how to tend to yourself is really important.
Yeah, thank you. And I love that there are so many options, there's so many ways in which you can find that spirituality and develop it and share it with others, because it can also, as you said, Rumi can feed everyone's soul if they want it to. Thank you so much, Dr. Safi, for your thoughts and reflections today. You've given us a lot to think about. I'd like to just make an announcement about the next session that's coming up. So we would like to invite you to join us for an interactive critical conversation to explore the topic of justice and social action in Islam with our speakers, Dr. Farooq Mitha and Honorable Haleema Welji. That will be on Sunday, July 5th at 1 p.m. Eastern, noon Central, and 10 a.m. Pacific. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope you enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much for having had me, and what a pleasure to have had a chance to devote time to these conversations, and would love to invite people to continue going deeper. And you know, one way is some of these courses that we have, illuminated courses. If that's not for you, find whatever it is that does feed your heart and continue exploring it, continue going deeper that way. And may God bless you. May God feed your soul. May God fill your hearts with light, always, always.
I'll also send a few resources that Dr. Safi has suggested in the chat if you are interested in that as well.
Sure.